Welcome, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck, David Griscom writing his book. Ben Case is back with us, though. Ben is a researcher, writer, longtime organizer based in the Rust Belt, also a research scholar at the Center for Work and Democracy, where he leads the Ballot Initiatives project. That's actually why he was on the most recent time on Left Reckoning here, and was it the first time, or at least the time before that, you were on for quantifying the slaughter going on in Gaza right now. So Ben, thanks for coming back to us.
Yeah, happy to be back.
Now, ballot initiatives. Before we get to ballot initiatives, actually, your piece in Jacobin here is titled "Bernie and AOC Put Your Platform on the Ballot." Why? What do you mean by that? Why isn't that just about electing better Democrats?
Yeah, so the inspiration for this piece was, so everyone knows Bernie and AOC have been on tour, right? We've all heard about it, the Fighting Oligarchy tour, and their message is attracting a lot of energy, right? Their basic message is that we don't live in a democracy, we live in an oligarchy, right? Democracy ruled by the people, oligarchy ruled by the few. When you have the richest people in the world in control of the most powerful government and they're using it to enrich themselves at everybody's expense, that's an oligarchy, and most of us kind of just get that. We're in this situation. They have this diagnosis of how did we get here? Well, we got here because the Democrats have not stood up to billionaires and big corporations, and they've allowed quality of life to slip. The cost of living is out of control. They haven't championed the needs of working people. They've allowed themselves to just fall into bed with the billionaire class. So all that is right and well, and it's gathering all this energy. The problem is there's nowhere for the energy to go right now, at least not through the electoral system. We know the problem. What do we do about it, right? Had to Chernyshevsky. So if you can't vote on it right now in terms of like a candidate, like Bernie's not running for office, probably not again. And it seems like the purpose of this maybe is to pass the baton to AOC as the sort of like head of this sort of Justice Democrats sphere, which makes sense. But again, there's nothing we can do about that right now. We look at the House just voting on cutting Medicaid. It's extremely unpopular, but they can do it, and there's nothing any of us can do about that. Okay, so the impetus was like, they're gathering all this energy. What do we do about it? Well, as you mentioned, like my job happens to be studying ballot initiatives, specifically as tools to advance people-first policies. In about half the states, you can put legislation directly on the ballot at the state level via petition and vote on it. So the basic idea is, okay, you've got all this energy now. You've got all these people whipped up about doing something about fixing healthcare, for example, fixing cost of living. Let's put it on the ballot. Like in the meantime, before we have another slate of politicians to work on and to vote for. And even when we do, let's put this stuff directly on the ballot. We know healthcare is broken. Let's get people covered. Let's put our energy there in the meantime. And in doing so, let's demonstrate that there is like political will behind actually fixing the problems that we're talking about. I think there's a ton of energy for that, and it seems sort of like an obvious place that energy can go. One of the things with ballot initiatives, and I learned this when I took over doing this research a few years ago, is just like they're not really in the popular consciousness in most places in the country of like something you can do. There's, in California, we know there's all the propositions in California, and there's all kinds of issues with that. There's certain states when they've become really staples of local politics, like in Arizona, Missouri, and elsewhere. But for a lot of people, when we talk about national politics, it just doesn't come up as an option. But it's this whole other sphere of electoral politics, if not at the state level, then at the municipal level, where you can just put policies directly up for a vote. And when you start thinking about politics that way, this is sort of my broader shtick on ballot initiatives, is like, you see a very different country. Like you don't see this red and blue country that's like sliding toward MAGA. You actually see a country where people want higher wages, higher minimum wages. People want affordable healthcare. People want people want to tax the rich to fund public services, and they'll actually vote for these things if they're on the ballot and not attached to one of the parties. So that was sort of the idea of the piece.
What I really like about this, and the last time we talked about ballot initiatives, is it's another angle of attack that should not be left out. And it comes from an assessment of like the status of our democracy that's not naive, but it's also not like, a whole bunch of people, which I see like saying, are we even going to have elections anymore? Right. I just don't really think that type of thought process is super valuable, frankly. I think like this more where it's like, okay, we do have huge impediments. So we need to be very deliberate about how we try to pressure this system. And I guess let's talk a little bit about last time you were on. And of course, actually, the first example of this that I remember that comes to mind is in Florida when Ron DeSantis won his election. And that was the same election that Floridians, they gave DeSantis that victory, but also voted to re-enfranchise felons who had served their time so they can vote again by an overwhelming margin. And then Florida got involved in the legal process. So which kind of points to, I think, what you're saying about the red blue thing, but also there's obstacles here too. If you just want to talk a little bit about that and maybe the Pittsburgh example.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of, and that's one where when you talk about felon reenfranchisement, right? So people may or may not know. So if you're convicted of a felony, you're disenfranchised in many places. Like you lose the ability to vote. And that's something that you carry with you even after you get out of prison, right? And so when you look at the deeply unfair and racialized nature of our carceral system, right, it starts to look like something that's like a legacy of the types of inequality that our nominal democracy was based off of like excluding certain categories of people based on race, based on class. And so this idea that we should re-enfranchise people, it cuts against a lot of the grains of like the political common sense. If you would just ask someone like, would this be popular on the ballot in like a Republican controlled state? Like, no, right? I mean, like, tough on crime laws and moral panics around crime and criminals, like specifically felons. Like this is a thing where just like you would think absolutely not. Right. But then you have these grassroots organizations who are in many cases led by formerly incarcerated people who are going around and knocking doors and telling their stories and explaining the situation. And it's a perfect example of how you can use the tools of direct democracy to not only, because this is a whole other so there's a whole industry of ballot initiatives that that's like can look at like what are the most viable policies to pass. You run the polling, you can hire the folks to do the signature collection. Like that's a tool in the toolbox also, but it can still have this logic of like following the polling. And I think the example in Florida is perfect in that like you can also convince people of things, right? This is what the deep canvassing people talk about as well. Like you can actually share your stories and convince people of things and like persuade people that an egalitarian society is better, like not to put too fine a point on it. So, they won that vote overwhelmingly, right? Despite also voting for Republican legislators. Then you get the problem, of course, of, right, this is not a silver bullet. And you always have to like remind people, because I think, especially in American politics, we're always looking for like the big win, right? And this was, I think, honestly, one of the problems with the first Bernie campaign, which is like, as much as it was invigorating, I think that it allowed us this fantasy, like, we could just elect the guy and he'll fix the things. And even if we like said that's like, we're not about like the great man of history, there's still that fantasy, right? And I think that's a very kind of American politics thing. And so when I start talking about ballot initiatives and like me and other people like me talk about this, because like once you get into it, it's hard to unsee. It's like, well, this works so well. There's these organizations that like know how to do this. They're so good at it. They can train folks. There's local organizations that can get involved. It's like, there's all these benefits. People can start to, oh, so you're saying like this is the way to fix it. It's like, well, no, this is a tool in the toolbox that I think is underused, but it also is still embedded in an elite controlled electoral system that's generally hostile to popular sovereignty. So Florida is a good example. So the people organize for this, it passes democratically, overwhelmingly, and then the legislature goes in and then finds a way to undo it. So in Florida, they can't just undo it outright. Most states you can't, although they're trying to give themselves the power to do that. They can't just go in and vote it and get away with it. But what they can do is they can tinker with other processes that basically gut its effects. So in that case, it was threatening like reincarceration and all kinds of fines and things. If you tried to register to vote, but there was any part of your like post-release process that you hadn't checked those boxes, and some of that stuff is complicated and difficult, and like if you did that wrong at all, you could risk reincarceration. And so it just had obviously a chilling effect on what was meant to be the outcome, which is people like being able to re-register to vote and participate in the system. You create all these incentives for people just not to do that. And so that's a perfect example of kind of like the limitations of the process. But to me, again, if we look a little bit deeper, it's not just about like, does it work or not in the short term, because the answer is kind of both. But if you continue to organize on that basis, it exposes the cleavage in our society between ordinary people, voters from both parties, and our elected representatives who are part of parties whose leaderships are beholden to billionaires and corporations. And so there's this fundamental divide in society between a lot of everyday people and our politicians. And that's just as true with Republicans, right? We see that in other states like South Dakota, where people passed minimum wage increase, and then the legislature tried to roll it back for underage workers, like child workers, unreal. And then people just went right back to the polls and undid it. You see this like fight between legislators and voters. And we can get into the whole thing because a lot of people say that, well, then why do people continue to vote for Republicans? And it's like, oh, we're back in this red and blue logic. And it's like, well, because the Democrats ultimately are, frankly, have proven themselves unable to actually fix these problems either. And their brand has become toxic in a lot of places for a lot of reasons. There's only two parties. So in some places, there's just really no other option. So I think it's just sort of the wrong way to look at it at this stage. I think we could build towards something different. But anyway, that might have gotten off track a bit there. But I think the Florida is a perfect example. And so us in Pittsburgh, I was part of 2 attempts to put a local referendum on the ballot. By the way, the terminology here, just so people don't get lost in this, a lot of different places use different words for these processes. So you hear like ballot initiatives, ballot measures, propositions, questions, issues, referendums. They're used differently in different places, but overall, we're talking about a vote on a policy instead of a politician. I should have said that outright. And in some places, yeah, they can mean kind of slightly different things. But anyway, so locally here, we were trying to put a question on the local ballot in Pittsburgh that would say that the city would have to divest from countries engaged in genocide. And there was sort of a few provisions to that. And there was sort of 2 attempts. Both times we got enough signatures to qualify for the ballot, but there were all these legal challenges filed by the Jewish Federation of Pittsburgh and also the city controller that pushed the question off the ballot. And so that people weren't allowed to vote on it. I can get into all the details. But I think what's important, but we've learned a lot of things, and I could talk forever about that experience. But what you see at the municipal level a lot in places like Pittsburgh and places like Atlanta, where people tried to put Stop Cop City on the ballot, got an overwhelming amount of signatures, and something very similar in the local city government and the courts, delayed it forever. It's still in sort of limbo right now. What you see is like something very similar to what you see in Republican-controlled states at the local level with Democrats, right? Like Pittsburgh is an all-Democrat city, all blue. We just had the mayoral primary, which everyone understands to be basically the mayoral race because the Democrat, there hasn't been a Republican mayor here for like a century or something. And so in places like that, it exposes also the ways that Democrats react very similarly when there's people try to put something on the ballot that threatens their interest. So again, it goes back to, I think the tool itself can help expose these things, but you have to be willing to continue to organize off of that, because if you just think like, we'll get this on the ballot, pass it, and we're done. No, it doesn't.
Yeah, I think people probably have some examples locally of marijuana legalization going through a similar thing. But let's talk about the example of Healthcare Rising Arizona and the Fairness Project in Arizona for a more successful example.
Yeah, the Fairness Project is this really interesting organization. They're pretty small. They have a handful of national staff, but they have this enormous impact. They've sort of discovered this system of like helping provide resources and connections and trainings and and funding to local groups in different states that want to put certain things on the ballot. So they ran a bunch of minimum wage initiatives in 2016. They won them all, mostly in some blue states, red states, purple states. And then they ran a number of Medicaid expansion initiatives, almost all in red states, and won all but one of them. And the one that they lost in Montana was it was due to like manipulation of the system by the Attorney General. We can get into all that. Like, you still have to face those things, but won almost all of these. And again, you think about like, okay, when the Affordable Care Act passed, the Republican Party made opposition to Medicaid expansion like an absolute pillar of their platform, right? To be a Republican was to be against Obamacare, right? Remember the like death panels or whatever they called it. And this was like, you would think that the country was split red and blue along this issue. But lo and behold, when people started putting the question in front of Republican voters, they're voting for like 60% or more in favor, right, of expanding access to Medicaid. Turns out Medicaid is really popular. Republicans get sick too. Republicans' kids need doctor's appointments too, right? And like medical crises are one of the leading causes of people falling into debt and poverty in this country. So expanded access to medical care is really, really popular. Anyway, so the Fairness Project was sort of able to develop this system where they partner with local groups in different states that want to do this. Instead of like parachuting in and doing it themselves, they create that network and they sort of give them access to, the kinds of knowledge you would need in the legal system, connections to folks who are part of this sort of like ecosystem of ballot initiatives in other states that can help them run an initiative. And they've been extremely successful in passing, people first policies, primarily in Republican controlled states. And, I actually really, at some point, like this is a story that should be told. And hopefully soon I'm going to actually try to write about this and talk about this. But, the Fairness Project was founded by labor. And a lot of these ballot measures are funded by and sponsored by labor organizations. And one of the things that I think is so powerful about that is like this has the seeds right now of like, it's like the embryo of class struggle electoral politics, of merging the power of organized labor in the marketplace and the economy with people power at the polls. And I think like that's a really exciting potential. So, the Fairness Project, like I said, was launched by labor, by United Healthcare Workers West, hospital and healthcare workers in California. Now they have, all kinds of backers. And Healthcare Rising Arizona is one of these groups that they partner with. That's like part of the same networks that ran the abortion rights initiative in Arizona. And, you talk to folks who were out there running this initiative. Again, you would think Arizona's, considered a red state. I guess technically it's purple. It has a Democratic governor, but my job's in Arizona and I live in Western Pennsylvania. I work remote, but considered a Republican state and has like generally they considered to have conservative values. You would think that abortion rights would be a really tough sell. Abortion is supposed to be this like polarizing issue that splits the country down the middle and nobody can talk or compromise with each other. But again, it turns out that if you separate it from like party identity and just go around asking people about it themselves, like Republicans also get abortions, Republican family members get abortions, like, and you have people telling their stories about their situations, you can persuade a lot of people and a lot of people are like ready to hear that, and that sort of like narrative of like, keep the government out of your doctor's appointments, resonates with a lot of people who have that more like Republican to libertarian mindset. And if you're not mixing it with like everything else that comes with the Democratic Party brand, but just like keeping it simple, like people should have a right to access like to abortion, like safe abortion care. It turns out they passed it by over 60% of the vote. They got hundreds of thousands of more votes for that initiative than either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. Right? And again, it's a perfect example of how you can demonstrate the popularity of these policies. And that's one where it is in effect. Like that did change the law there. And, they now have access to abortion. And, I quote, Kelly Hall, who's the director of the Fairness Project in the article, talks about how like, it's still a scary situation nationally in terms of abortion rights, but it would be so much worse if we hadn't had 14 out of 17 of the statewide abortion votes since Roe v. Wade got overturned. 14 out of 17 have gone toward reproductive freedom, right? If that hadn't happened, they would be working on an abortion ban nationally right now. But it's been demonstrated now in state after state that abortion rights are popular. And I think that's like, again, that's sort of evidence that you can do a lot of things with this that are even bigger than the specific states themselves.
Yeah, and I think both the unpopularity of the Democratic Party, like that's an obstacle that people need to work around, and this is like a good way to avoid a lot of that baggage, frankly. You write here, egalitarian measures that focus on economic redistribution pass 75% of the time. Talking about policies like raising minimum wage, expanding access to Medicaid, curbing predatory debt collection, taxing the rich to fund public services. Then you continue. In fact, the states controlled by Republican Party economic justice initiatives passed 92% of the time. I mean, and again, like that, I am from North Dakota. Like, I feel like most people aren't going to vote against a minimum wage increase there.
People don't. The minimum wage has been on the ballot in the 21st century, has been on the ballot 28 times at the state level, and it's passed 27 of those times with an average of 60% of the vote. No, of course, this is a no-brainer for people. Like, cost of living is out of control. People are struggling. A lot of people work for a living. Most people work for a living, and a lot of people make low wages. A lot of people struggle to get by. You ask people about raising the minimum wage, it's a no-brainer if you take this to the ballot. Like a lot of the things we talk about in terms of like left populism, it is popular, right? And this is what this tool is designed for. It was what it was introduced to the United States for by the populist movement, a century plus ago. Was a way of getting around the elite-controlled two-party system and just putting some of these questions directly on the ballot. In fact, the one minimum wage increase that lost in the 21st century was just this last year in California. It lost by less than 1% of the vote. And it was like a pretty poorly constructed initiative because it was going to raise the minimum wage, but a number of key industries have already raised their own minimum wages above that. So like you sort of take away something. So fast food workers, healthcare workers already had higher minimum wages. And it was also, it was funded by one person who was like a sort of a pet project, not really like organized for in the way that, for example, some of these like labor-based organizations can organize more like labor organizing, much more connective types of organizing. And so even despite all that, it lost by less than 1% of the vote. And that's like the single failure case for minimum wage increases.
And I think one good way to tell that the people with power consider this potent is the way that legislatures are basically conspiring to pass policies that neuter the ballot measures. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and so right, so since people have been using this tactic in like the past 10 years, and we can talk about the whole history of this, like before 10, 15 years ago, ballot initiatives were generally associated with conservative movements. Like we could talk about all the way that happened. But, since like 2014, 2016, we've seen a ton of minimum wage, Medicaid expansion, caps on predatory debt collection, paid family and sick leave, all this sorts of stuff being extremely successful at the ballot. And abortion rights, of course. And since then, we see state legislatures across the country, primarily in Republican-controlled states, but across the country, trying to find ways to kneecap the process. So not just like undermine initiatives themselves, which they do, like in Arizona when people passed like tax the rich to fund public education, the legislature went in and gutted it and the judiciary declared it unconstitutional and they got rid of that specific thing. But then they also started putting their own measures on the ballot, right? Legislatures can also put things on the ballot, like without doing the whole signature collection thing, they can just do it themselves, trying to sort of trick people into giving up their own decision-making power to make the ballot initiative process harder. State bureaucracies, like without putting things on the vote, have done all sorts of things to try and nickel and dime the process. Legislatures have tried to sort of pass measures that would let them undermine ballot initiatives or overturn them. So all sorts of things to try and just make this process harder and harder. And I think it shows that it's a threat, right? They consider this a threat that people can go over their heads and pass policies themselves. Legislatures don't tend to like that, especially if they're beholden to corporations and people who are making everyone's life harder to profit themselves. You want to keep that decision-making power in the state house if you can help it. Right. So there's all sorts of examples of this. We could go, state by state. I mean, the most extreme one so far is Mississippi, where the Supreme Court, a few years ago, they passed medical marijuana legalization in Mississippi by ballot initiative. And the city in Mississippi sued to overturn it on the basis that when the Mississippi state constitution was rewritten, which I think was in 1991, when they got the ballot initiative process, Mississippi had 5 congressional districts. And ballot initiative law is different in different places. Usually you have to get a certain percentage of the electorate or the previous gubernatorial vote or the population, depending on the state. You get a certain percentage of people sign a petition in a certain time frame sometimes, and you submit it, whatever, to get the question on the ballot. Sometimes there's rules around where those signatures have to come from. So in this case, the Mississippi state law said you had to get signatures from all 5 congressional districts in order to put a question on the ballot. Well, since then, Mississippi has been reduced to 4 congressional districts. So the ballot measure for medical marijuana gathered signatures from 4 congressional districts because there are only 4 congressional districts. And the lawsuit said, well, it should be thrown off because they didn't get signatures from 5 congressional districts. And that's what the state constitution says. And the state Supreme Court ruled with the plaintiff and said, yep, this is unconstitutional. They didn't get. So effectively, like technically they have ballot measures in the Constitution, but you can't actually use them because the precedent says now that functionally you can't get enough signatures to put the thing on the ballot. That's an extreme example. That's like absurd.
It's like a video game glitch almost.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
level's not
100%.
accessible. It should be there, but it's not.
No, 100%. The Onion couldn't come up with that. You know what I mean? Like, but there's like less extreme examples, but still the same sort of the same type of thing. We're just trying to make the process as inaccessible, as difficult as possible. Again, we can go into all the details. There's plenty of stuff out there, and you can link to the data. By the way, when you talked about like the 92% of economic redistribution measures that pass in red states, that comes from a report that the center I work at that we just put out called Majority Rules 2025. And so if you go in there, you can see a lot of resources on this stuff and elsewhere too. There's a lot of links in the Jacobin articles as well, where you can like learn more about the specifics in different places. This has like been a wave. And we see the sort of like sharing of strategies. So when something works in one place, we'll see it then replicated elsewhere. So like, for example, we saw like we see all sorts of states trying to put 60% rules on the ballot, so that certain types of initiatives, you have to get 60% of the vote in order to pass, right? And we saw that be successful, a successful anti-democracy measure in Florida, where people put abortion rights on the ballot. It got 57% of the vote, higher percentage of the vote than Donald Trump, who won the state. But it didn't pass because they passed a 60% rule a few years ago. Right. So we see things like that. So then that's replicated in other places. And right. So like, there's a need to sort of fight to protect and expand this capability that we have. I think that's really important, like fighting to protect the direct democracy mechanism. At the same time, I also think it's important to take the lessons that we've learned from these initiative wins already, again, to tell us that like there are certain policies, specifically economic justice policies, but also other things like abortion rights that are popular and that people will vote directly for, not just like on an opinion poll. People will vote to legislate that themselves. And that shows that we have a pathway to a left populism that can win at the ballot. And so this is where it comes back to the Jacobin piece, where it's sort of calling on Bernie and AOC to be like, throw your weight behind these state initiatives that can actually get people covered by medical care, protect their Medicaid, that can actually raise people's wages, that can actually improve people's lives. And then let's not just stop there, right? Because they have the capacity to then unite those sorts of wins into a national platform for those kinds of policies, to then push for that in states that don't have ballot initiatives, that can't do it directly.
Right, 100%. Well, the thing you mentioned, historically, these being typically a tool of conservative side, and now that shifting, is that a change in the electorate? Is that in the political systems? What broadly accounts for that?
Yeah, so to sort of try to like condense it, right? The ballot initiative idea was introduced to the US in the late 1800s by the populist movement, the People's Party, which I think David knows something about, is going to be writing about. I'm really looking forward to that book. As sort of an idea of, it wasn't their main thing, but it was sort of one of the ideas of like, okay, we have these two parties. They're both controlled by the rich in general. We should have ways of legislating ourselves. This was like a multiracial coalition of farmers and workers in the Midwest and Appalachia and the South. And they'd heard about the ballot initiative idea from Switzerland through networks and sort of like an experimental thing. South Dakota is the first state to do it at the state level. They sort of introduced this as an idea. It gets picked up again, right? They tried to merge with the Democratic Party, and that was a disaster, and the whole thing came apart, which, just saying. Anyway,
Stay tuned to David's book.
Yeah. So the progressive movement picked it up in the early 20th century as sort of part of a series of package of policies that could attempt to make the sort of political system a little bit more accessible to everyday people. And that's sort of a whole other history that goes along with primaries and other sort of tweaks to the electoral system. And so we see a couple dozen states adopt this progressive politicians in the early 20th century. They start passing things legislatures don't like. Not all things we would like some some of them are xenophobic, some of them are just sort of like of the time. But they also people were passing things like labor rights and enfranchisement for women. So legislators do basically what they're doing now, and they try to make it harder and harder, and they sort of stem the tide of states adopting it. And that kind of calcifies it more or less where it is now, where some states have it, some don't. The rules are kind of janky and different. In the 70s, some Republicans in California figured out that you could pass pretty much whatever you wanted on the ballot if you framed it as lowering people's taxes. People paid taxes, and they figured this out via this property tax limit that they put on the ballot in California. It was very successful. It launched what became known as the tax revolt, that, among other things, elevated Ronald Reagan in his sort of stature as like a champion of that. But that kind of like marked the turn to conservatives figuring out like, oh, we can use this actually to pass certain things. If you kind of fool people a little bit, you sort of make it half about what it really is and half about something else, then you can actually get a lot of things done. And so they use it for things like, tough on crime and three strikes laws, like gin up moral panics around crime, and you can get people to vote on, expanding the carceral system. We see Republicans using it on like, anti-marriage equality stuff to try and like turn out their base to vote for Republicans. And there's kind of a bunch of like research and literature on whether or not that works. There's kind of a whole debate around that. But that's what sort of the mechanism was associated with. That's, if I knew anything about it when I was younger, that's kind of what I thought. I associated it with conservatives out west, and that kind of general view of populism that I think a lot of us have, this kind of negative view of like the mob, right? That I think is kind of in mass culture. And again, it's mainly labor organizations about 10 years ago, but also groups that were like working on marriage equality and wanted to be like, why does this keep losing at the ballot? Like, how do we figure this out? Right. And I've been talking to some folks, and like, that's where deep canvassing comes from, of some of these folks in California being like, we're actually going to start really talking to people door to door, like not even canvassing for anything, just like, we want to understand why this keeps losing. And they were able to like flip the narrative. And then, now like marriage equality became a really successful thing by a ballot measure. So there's that. And there's also, a lot of these labor groups out west, like in California and elsewhere, were using ballot initiatives to pass policies they couldn't get via collective bargaining, or sometimes as leverage as part of other sort of campaigns. And that's kind of complicated, but they were kind of started using this mechanism and then realized like we can actually do quite a bit. And again, that's where the Fairness Project comes from, was, like working people, hospital and healthcare workers being like, actually, like, labor is dying. We can't collectively bargain for enough people to reverse some of these economic trends. We should start just putting some of this stuff on the back, organizing it almost like it's a labor campaign. And, it turns out it was really successful. And so I think a lot of other folks started like taking notice of that mechanism and realizing, oh, we can do all kinds of things actually if we just like take it directly to the people.
I mean, the propaganda and organizational value of all those conservative ballot initiatives, like, it seems like that probably had a pretty useful effect for them, without having waded into those debates. Ben, at the Center for Work and Democracy, anywhere else people should follow your work at?
No, I'm not very good at like promoting myself that way. I write on this topic for Jacobin and elsewhere, and working on a book on the topic. Center for Work and Democracy is trying to do a bunch of stuff supporting various movements. So, check us out. And otherwise, no, just keep listening.
Thanks for your work, Ben.
Thanks a lot.